We acknowledge that the lands upon which we live, learn, and work are the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. We thank them for sharing these lands and commit as an organization, as educators, and as individuals to an ongoing relationship that recognizes and respects the lands, traditions, and culture of the Anishinaabe people. Miigwech. It's my pleasure actually to introduce Drew this morning. I have known Drew since she was a 17-year-old high school student, and I don't want to embarrass her, but outside of my family, she's my favorite person in the entire universe. And I think if you listen very intently to her, you'll see why that is. Today, she's going to be speaking about an indigenous voice, the roots and branches of misconceptions about Anishinaabe people. She's going to explore with you the historical truths of Indigenous peoples and how gaps in our information have led to a single narrative or story and misrepresentation through biases and stereotypes. It's yours now, Drew.
Perfect. Thank you so much. What a great introduction. I'm just going to share my presentation. Give me a second. Okay. Are we able to see it?
Yep, you're good, Drew.
Perfect, thank you. So welcome. Thank you for participating in the speaker series, and I look forward to hearing some comments or questions that you may have during or after the presentation. So what I wanted to look at today, like Ruth had mentioned before, is the roots and branches of misconceptions about Anishinaabe people and how they are stemmed from the historical past. So if we look at the learning intention or the goal of today, what I would like you to get out of this presentation is that we explore the historical background of Indigenous biases and stereotypes so that we as a community have a better understanding of Indigenous history and how that history has impacted perceptions of Indigenous people, whether it be in our everyday lives or portrayals of people in the media. So there was a bit of an introduction about me, but I'd like to go a little bit further and just start by talking about my background in schooling. So I did graduate from Western Quebec School Board at Darcy McGee High School in Elmer. And what I found was there was little to no representation of me, my culture, or the culture of other Indigenous peoples in the school curriculum. So what I saw growing up was a need within myself to know more about it. So what I did is I went to Algonquin College in Indigenous Studies, where I discovered things about my Indigenous ancestry that I didn't know before. And from there stemmed this interest in learning about other people's backgrounds and other people's histories, or the history of the land and how we interact with it as different peoples coming together. So looking at it, I wanted to learn more. So what I did was I went to Bachelor of Arts program in history at Carleton University in Ottawa. And from there, I was able to see different histories of different peoples across Turtle Island, which is North America, but also across the globe. And from there, I thought to myself that there was a huge gap in what we were taught about other peoples, about how diverse nations could be. So I wanted to inform people. I wanted to show that there is a lot to learn about other peoples. So that's why I wanted to become a teacher. So I did go to get my Bachelor of Education at the University of Ottawa. So that is my schooling history, and now I've been fortunate enough to work with the WQSB as a teacher and share my knowledge through that. Another big aspect that has led me to be here today is my cultural background. So I am a James Bay Cree from Mississauga, Quebec, which is in northern Quebec, and is a part of the Iuichi, which is our land. And I'm also from the Anishinaabe Algonquin Reserve of Kirigan-Zibi Anishinaabe. So that dual history of two different nations of Indigenous people is something that is important to me for everybody to know. And the reason why I'm mentioning it now in my introduction is that I want people to be aware that this is my perspective. This is my history, and a lot of these things are through this lens. There are so many diverse nations, as you could see in the picture, that there are so many different Indigenous reserves or nations, even in Quebec, let alone across North America. So when we have to take that into account, that there are so many different cultural backgrounds of people. So when we look at it, we have to take into consideration the different cultures, customs, and language dialects. So from my perspective, being a part of my school or my reserve, Kirigan-Zibi and Rapid Lake are very close together. They are two nations that are both Algonquin and an hour and a half maybe apart from each other, but they have different culture. They have a different custom. They have different language dialects. So even cultures that are closer together, they are different. And that's something we need to take into consideration when looking at different nations. They're not all the same. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to start by going into the topic of identity. And what do we think when we think about Indigenous peoples or ourselves and identity? So where I want to start is the history of a name, because that's the first thing you think about when you talk about identity. And what happens when you're looking at your last names. Names are usually registered to the Canadian government and historically different religious orders. So there are at some point in Canada's history, you had to register with the priest of a Protestant or Christian church for acknowledgement of your last name or of your family name. And what happened is Euro-Canadians often found native names to be confusing or hard to pronounce. So if they were present, they were hard to pronounce for people who weren't a part of that language group. There are also instances historically where Indigenous peoples used their names differently. Some people didn't have last names. Some people worked with clan names or spirit names, and many, like I said, didn't have family names. So what the Canadian government did and different religious orders did was they wanted to extinguish traditional ties to their language, to Indigenous identity. So what they did was upon registering their family, a lot of the Indigenous names were changed. So in the example of my name, McDougall is not the original last name of my family. And that is because it was a very hard word to pronounce for the people registering my family. So they took it upon themselves to change that name. My original last name, and it was difficult to go back generations to find it, was in fact Makatiki Jakokwe, which it is very hard to pronounce, but it is a part of my historical past, my ancestral past, and eliminating that from my family tree, my family line, has an impact. And it was for the purpose of extinguishing those ties to my culture, to my land and my history with my family. So when we look at that, and we look at something as simple as our last name, we kind of see this starting to form of these, the Canadian government and these people in charge putting little pieces of their own history or their own language into our sense of self, our sense of identity. So when we look at that and we look at our ideas of identity, we also need to look at the Indian status. So what Indian status is it was introduced in 1876 as a part of the Indian Act. And what the Indian Act was, or Indian status, was the government regulated system to identify who would legally be considered Indian to Canada. And in this case, we use the term Indian just because in that political document, in that document that still exists today, that is the word they still use. So we don't use it in regular society or in our schools because it is seen as derogatory. We use the terms First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, or the specific cultural group. But for the purpose of this presentation, we are going to use the term Indian because that is what the government documents still use today. So what I do when we look at Indian status and the government gets to determine who is going to be considered Indian in Canada and who is going to get access to those rights, what I've done in my class is I've created this Indian status activity where you as a participant get to see what are some of the criteria it takes to be considered Indian in this country. So for example, any Indian who becomes a professional, like a lawyer, a doctor, a minister of religion, is automatically enfranchised and loses Indian status. Any Indian, whether man or woman, who gains a university degree under the Indian Act becomes ineligible for Indian status. Within the original Indian Act, an Indian could only be considered Indian within the government if the father is Indian. So right here, we see instances or criteria that is put in place as a means of isolating Indigenous peoples. And if you wanted to become educated, if you wanted to gain notoriety in society, you had to forfeit your right for Indigenous status and therefore not be allowed to have those rights as original people of Canada, original people of the land. And so what we see through history is a lot of people who had to lose their Indigenous status in order to survive in mainstream society. And what we do in the class, and what I hope to go through very quickly today, is one of the character profiles that I use in my class. So these are by no means singular instances. This has been something that has happened frequently. So although this character profile is fictional, I've made this person up, it is by no means uncommon. This has happened to many people and even people in my own family. So just keeping in mind that this was an actual Canadian government system for the purpose of assimilating Indigenous peoples into everyday society and eliminate their right to the land. So I will read the excerpt with you. Chelsea is an Algonquin woman from Rapid Lake First Nations Reserve. She is 52 years old and is a recent widow. Her husband, Rick, was a Woodland Cree First Nations. Rick and Chelsea had 3 children together that have since grown up and moved away. Together, Chelsea and Rick own a house on his Cree Reserve. His reserve is called Beaver Lake Cree Nation. Chelsea works as the manager of the community's grocery store, which is owned by Rick's family. So looking at that, what I had my students do is determine whether or not they would be considered Indian to the Canadian government. So looking at that, what would Chelsea be considered Indian to the Canadian government, or would she be ineligible for Indian status? So what we see here is, okay, Chelsea is Algonquin on her own. She is from a reserve that is recognized by the Canadian government. She also married a Native person, and they live together on his reserve, and she works on reserve. So you would assume that she would keep her Indigenous status, when in reality, her situation, she would not be eligible for Indigenous status. And the reason being, once marrying, her status is dependent on that of her husband's. So because she is married to him, her Indigenous status to Canada is now dependent on him. So when he passes away, because that's what a recent widow means, when he passes away, he takes his Indigenous status with him. He takes his Indian status. So she, even though she's Algonquin to begin with, she is no longer eligible because she was once married to someone who is no longer here. Depending on the reserve, she could also be forced to leave her family home. And the reason being for that is that some reserves get government funding based on the population of your people. So if she is not a status Indian, then she would not be considered a part of that system. So they could, depending on the reserve, they could decide whether or not she has access to the reserve or to services from the reserve. And this, as you could see through this example, has a major impact on lifestyle and identity. It could disrupt your life for sure. Other reasons for losing your Native status, according to the Indian Act, would be leaving the reserve for more than 5 years, buying land off reserve, fighting for your country as a soldier, and coming back as a war veteran. Those are grounds to take away Indigenous status. So when we look at this idea and this government system that was meant to take away these rights and assimilate Indigenous peoples into the society, we think of the stereotypes that are coming into play. We think of the stereotypes that are coming into play. Often, there's this assumption that Indigenous people should know everything about their culture, should have this understanding of their culture and that of other Native cultures, or categorizing people based on their status. Are you a status Indian? Are you not a status Indian? And being stereotyped based on those histories, when in reality, we don't know the reasons why they are not a status Indian. Maybe it's for a reason such as Chelsea, where she should, rightfully so, have access to being determined an Indigenous person in Canada. But because of her circumstances and because the government specifically made those rules to convert people into society, that's something we have to take into consideration. It is not the fault of Indigenous peoples for not knowing their history with the Canadian government, and we shouldn't assume when looking at it at whether or not they're in Indian status or they don't have Indian status. We should determine based on their willingness to learn their culture, and moving forward, how can we better support them in understanding their historical past with the Canadian government and what the government's intentions were. And what I'd like to show you is a quote about the Indian Act. So when we look at it, we see Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs. What he writes is, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question, no Indian department. That is the whole object of this bill. So this man, Duncan Campbell Scott, who is known to Canadians as the poet of Confederation for his poetry, he was the superintendent, so the man in charge of the Department of Indian Affairs, the department that determines how the government will interact with Native people. This was his viewpoint as he ran that department. This was what he thought of Indigenous peoples. So what we see are a lot of systems in the government set in place to dismantle Indigenous language and dismantle the culture as a part of Canadian society. And what we see when we talked about Indian status just a few moments ago, some of those things are still in place. There was amendments made in 1984 or 85, but what those amendments were amendments made to, how would you say this? To dismantle discrimination according to sex. So if you were a man or a woman and they were discriminatory based on being a man or a woman, then they amended those rights. Those other aspects, the one about being a war veteran, the criteria about getting a university degree or getting land off the reserve, those are still put in place. Those are still active today. There have been no amendments made for those acts. Although they are not regulated, there's nobody from the government going around and checking. Those are still put in place in the original Indian Act. Okay, so even if they're not regulated, they are still there. So the government could potentially go back and use that as criteria because it hasn't been amended yet. And that's something we need to take into consideration when moving forward, looking at the Canadian government and how it reacts to Native peoples. And what we see through the Indian Act are different systems of trying to convert Native people or trying to keep them isolated unless they want to give up those rights. And we see that through Indian status, the implementation of reserves, and through residential schools, which was a government system that lasted more than 100 years and only ended in 1996 for residential schools. And this act created a number of colonial laws that aimed to eliminate First Nations culture in favor of assimilation. So we see this dynamic of how the Canadian government is going to go forward and interact with Native peoples. And we see that in the legacy of residential schools. So if we look at residential schools from a very basic perspective, we see that 4 to 18-year-olds, so a lot of children, Indigenous children from ages 4 to 18, were put in boarding schools where they had to stay there unless they were let out at summer break or winter break. They were unable to practice their language, customs, culture, and they were even isolated from their family and community. There are instances of residential schools where siblings, brothers and sisters, cousins were put in the same school, but were not allowed to interact with each other because the principal or the person running the school didn't want them to feed off each other, remember their culture, remember their language, and practice that. So they didn't allow the siblings in some cases to interact with each other for the sole purpose of, and I quote, to get rid of the Indian in the child. So at the basic level of residential schools, this was commonplace. This isolation from their families and this inability or you were unable to practice your culture. It was commonplace. And I'm not even going to go into the more in-depth, more tragic instances of residential schools. So based on the varying age groups of this presentation, I'm not going to go into depth on the atrocities of residential schools. However, when we look at it, it is a part of the history of Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government. It was a system of assimilation aimed to free the Canadian government from their agreements to Indigenous peoples. We see that it's present in the media. It was present back then, but there was still this sense of the Canadian government needing to keep this hidden from people because it was the sole purpose to get rid of the Indian in the child, to extinguish Indigenous culture. And we see this through atrocious behaviors in the school. So we need to take that into consideration before putting judgment on Indigenous peoples and acknowledging that there was a brutal history on their original lands and by the Canadian government that was at a time in our history, historically, we were meant to have a partnership. So what we see coming from residential schools is intergenerational impacts. And what I've done here is we have an empty family tree. And if we look at this, and if we look at surface level, let's pretend at the top of the family tree, we have our grandparents, right? And then the second tier, we have our own mother and father, and then us at the bottom here. So let's pretend at the top, we have a grandmother who went to residential school. So surface level, she faced isolation. She was taken away from her family, her friends, and her community at a very young age. She was put in a boarding situation where she had to sleep in a room with many other people. And she had living conditions where she lived in the school system. She lived there. She wasn't able to go back and see her family until summer or winter break. So what we see is already surface level, no abuse at this point in this situation. We see isolation. We see those impacts. So looking at intergenerational impacts, bleeding through the generations to follow, what could happen? The grandmother now has a disconnect from her family and community. There are situations and instances where people coming out of residential school were no longer able to interact with their own family because their family spoke a native language. And for the years they went to residential schools, they were not allowed to practice their language. So they were not able to communicate with their family once they got out of there. What we also see is people feeling uneasy in society because they've been isolated in that school for so long. They don't know what regular society looks like. They don't know how to interact with other people. We also see examples of people being unable to care for their children. So for our example of the family tree and the grandmother going there, she didn't have a role model, a mom, a dad, a guardian that took care of them. She had her teachers who ran the school. She had other students that were there. So what happens is when they left residential schools, they didn't know how to take care of their own children. because they've never seen that modeled for them. And in some cases, if the trauma was more difficult, if there was instances of abuse or neglect in these schools, we see this pattern of children coming out of residential schools being unable to cope with past traumas or knowing what resources they have, going to see a doctor or a therapist to combat their traumas, to work on their traumas, because just being isolated from your family, taken away from them because the government said so, and telling you that your culture, your language is not important, that has trauma. So people leaving didn't know how to react, didn't know how to respond. So what we see is different media portrayals of Indigenous peoples. And if you don't know Indigenous people, then this is the only view you have of them. This is the single narrative, the single story you have of these people. So what you see in the media is Native people with these issues, with substance abuse issues, with suicide, homelessness, low socioeconomic standing, so being less wealthy or poorer than other people. So when we look at the writing at the bottom, we see that Canada is only Indigenous people only represent 4% of all the Canadian population, 4%. But suicide rates are twice the national average in 2011. And as we see in the orange picture, it is slowly climbing. 5 to 6 times higher suicide rate for Indigenous or First Nations youth than non-Aboriginal youth. And that was from 2018. So we see the 7 years difference of how this has impacted the people. And we also see in the Inuit youth 11 times higher suicide rate. And that is because of isolation, being very far up north and not having access to healthcare systems or mental health awareness or coping strategies to help with those traumas. So what I want you to get out of that is that there is a reason behind these media portrayals. And if we don't look at the history behind what could have caused these problems, we don't have a full picture of what's happening and how it bleeds through generations of people. And in the end, it hurts these people because they're only portrayed in one view. And people who have no acknowledgement of the history judge based on just what they see. They're only one viewpoint. So that's how biases start, when you don't take into account the history behind the people. And this is not just a contemporary problem. Residential schools ended quite recently in 1996, in my lifetime, but it even has an impact looking back historically. When we think of historically, we look at first contact, and we learn throughout school about Jacques Cartier, the French explorer, and his crew. And we learn through Jacques Cartier's journals that his crew was plagued with an epidemic. They got a sickness when coming to the New World, and they didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to cure themselves. So what they did was Chief Donnacona and his 2 sons recognized that illness because it was immune to, or it was immune. It was what's the word? It was a part of that land. Like they recognized it. It's something that did happen on the land before. It was natural to that space. So what we see is a difference in health and immunity. The French explorers came to Canada and they were not immune to those diseases They had no interaction with those diseases before, so it hit their crew hard. But what happened was that chief, him and his sons had the medicine needed for that, because they knew, they've seen it before, and they knew what could cure it. So what we see today is the stereotype that Indigenous peoples are on the priority list of vaccines. And people, from their narrow viewpoint, they see, why are Indigenous peoples being seen as this priority for these vaccines, for these medicines? And the truth is, when we look way back to our first contact, it was the same for the French people coming to our Turtle Island as we know it today. And they were not susceptible. And the same would have happened if Indigenous peoples went to Europe. We would have been plagued with diseases, and the people in Europe would have gotten diseases from Indigenous peoples as well, because we are not immune to the same illnesses. So what happens is Indigenous peoples in Canada are seen as a priority because all these outside diseases, they are more susceptible to them because they don't have the same immunity as if you were on the continent of Europe. So there is historical factors impacting Indigenous peoples today. And if you don't understand that, then when you look at the media and it says First Nations peoples are in line to get this vaccine, then all you see is Indigenous people prioritized, and people make biases based on that, when there is actual history that proves that that's how it should be. For the protection of everybody, that's how it should be. And we see this difference in our history when we look at our Canadian food guide, for example. Most people don't know this, but there is a Indigenous Peoples of Canada food guide. And the reason for that being is, if you just think about it, what are your ancestors used to eating? What are my ancestors used to eating? They ate different things because they came from different places. So if you look at the Indigenous food guide, you see there's more foods that are natural to Canada. There are more proteins, and you could see less grains, less milk products, dairy products. And that is because, if you think back to it, if you're from a European country, if your family is not originally from here, then your ancestors have seen grains, certain dairy products for a long time. Whereas Indigenous peoples of Canada were not used to having dairy products. We're not used to having grains. So if you think historically, Indigenous peoples have only been introduced to certain foods since first contact, so maybe 400 years, depending on what they brought over. So what we see today, based on that, is high levels of diabetes in Indigenous reserves communities. We also see high levels of gluten intolerance or lactose intolerance, and that is because our bodies as Indigenous peoples are not as used to those foods as European peoples, because European peoples have been maybe enjoying those foods for thousands of years, depending on where they came from. So taking that into consideration, we now see that there is a reason for these differences in our histories and in our contemporary everyday. There's a reason why there's high levels of these systems. And it's only by knowing the history that we could really appreciate and know where they stem from. So what we see is people being acknowledged and being understood because we understand their history. And what I like to think about is knowledge makes the work more logical. Awareness and accountability. So if we have a knowledge and understanding of our work, of our history together as people, then we have a better understanding of those people. We understand now that Indigenous peoples have a rough history with the Canadian government. And all we see in the media are things like Indigenous people fighting for their rights to land, or Indigenous peoples finding problems with clean drinking water, with access to funding. We see these issues, but if we don't understand the historical past of them, then we can't really understand the people, and we can't really make decisions on an accurate decision on whether or not this is normal or not. So other topics of study are really important, and I've mentioned some today and about the Indian Act, but there are so many other aspects of Canada that are not talked about when we're referring to Indigenous peoples, like the 60 scoop, like Indigenous sterilization of women, relocation of communities, the reserve system, missing and murdered Indigenous women, disproportionate numbers in the foster care system of Indigenous children, and access to clean drinking water on reserves. Understanding historical pasts, or why these things happen, creates understanding for the people. We cannot accurately understand people if we only have one view of them. We have what the media portrays them to be. We have to take it upon ourselves to look deeper and try to understand them rather than judge them. So moving forward towards the last slide of my presentation, we're looking at equity and equality. Equality is treating everybody the same, but in my opinion, we cannot treat everybody the same because we need to acknowledge historical impacts of people. So if you put an Indigenous person with a non-Indigenous person and say, we're equal, let's all be treated the same, it would not be as successful as it could be if we used equity, because there is a history of trauma in Indigenous people's past that often go neglected and that are often misunderstood or not even mentioned. So that history has boiled down, has trickled through the family tree again, and has been an impact on Indigenous identity and Indigenous sense of self. So we have to take that into consideration when we look at how we're going to treat people moving forward. We don't all have the same history. We don't all have the same understanding of what it is to be a Canadian in this society. So taking that into account, moving forward, I hope every one of you showing interest in this presentation, I hope that you're treating people with respect regardless, but also taking it upon yourself to look at how you could best help Indigenous peoples or other peoples of color because they have a different history than yourselves with the land, with the Canadian government. And moving forward, how can we all better help each other? Because understanding everybody's history will help us understand how we can move forward and hopefully not repeat those mistakes that we've had in the past. So to end my presentation, I'd like you guys all to think about how you could help each other and how you could respectfully look towards equity instead of equality, realizing that nobody is trying to guilt you or trying to make you feel bad about your history, but we're trying to move together forward so that we could all move towards being accepted in this diverse country where we can all accept each other's differences and be aware of the traumas that were put in place so that we hopefully don't repeat them again. And so that when we look at news articles and we see people judging based on those stereotypes and those biases, hopefully at some point we will be responsible enough to say, this is a one-sided narrative of these people. There is a history behind this, and it's our job to go and look for it. So I'd like to thank you guys for listening to my presentation, and I'd be glad to answer any questions moving forward. Thank you.
That's great, Drew. I'm just watching the. Are you able to see the chat box?
Yeah, I can see the chat now.
Okay, I'll let you answer the questions as they come up. But just in the meanwhile, I see that there's some stuff being typed now. But on behalf of the whole Western Quebec School Board and all of the stakeholders, students, staff, parents, commissioners, thank you very much for the presentation, as it is clearly having an impact on all of us. It's very valued and well received, and we're very grateful. Thank you, Drew.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody for taking an active role in seeing this as important, and hopefully moving forward, all of us gaining more knowledge about each other. I saw some of my little friends from my school. Hi. Oh, my other friends.
Hello. Hi. Hello. Hey. Hello.
They're already used to me talking about it all the time.